Good evening and welcome to the Palestine Exploration Fund. My name is Michael Talbot and I'm the Honorary Secretary of the PEF, and it's my pleasure to welcome those in person to our wonderful premises here in Greenwich and those online joining us on YouTube and other social media platforms. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Dan Reynolds, who's a senior lecturer at the Centre for Byzantine, Ottoman and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Birmingham, where in some ways he was intellectually born and bred, and he researches and teaches there on a wide range of topics related to Byzantine history, particularly the earlier periods, and to our favourite subject, the history of Palestine. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about the inheritance of Christ. That's enough for me. Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to Felicity and the rest of the PEF for inviting me to speak. So, God did not give the sites of the prophets and the relics of Christ and the places of the apostles and martyrs to any people save the Christians. It is they who sought them out and honoured them and built churches upon them. That was done by their Christian kings and beneath the kings by governors and others out of eagerness and on account of their great faith. These words from the Kitab al-Burhan are attributed to the deacon Peter Vutros of Beit Ras and are believed to have been written around about 825 to 850. Peter was a Melkite, a broad sort of anachronistic term which we use to describe Christians living within the Muslim world who remained in communion with Constantinople and Rome. Now his toponym locates him, either by birth or by residence, to Beit Ras, the former late Roman city of Capitolius, just east of the Jordan River. Now Peter, like his better-known contemporaries Theodore Abu Qura and Amr al-Basri, stand among the first generation of Christian writers who we can name and who worked almost exclusively in Arabic and sought to defend the core beliefs of the Christian faith against Islamic critique, namely the doctrines of the Incarnation, the Trinity, and the authenticity of the Gospels. Peter's line of argumentation, however, was not without its novelties. The Kitab al-Burhan represents one of the earliest known attempts by a Melkite writer to define and map a sacred topography of churches in defence of Melkite beliefs. Beginning with the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth, Peter lists the churches of the Arabian Palestinian region following the life of Christ in sequential order, from his birth in Bethlehem to the churches overlying the locations of his miracles, death, resurrection, and eventual ascension on the Mount of Olives. Later in the text, Peter describes the relics and churches of the Mandelion in Edessa, St. Paul in Damascus, St. Peter in Rome, and the tombs of Mary and the prophets Moses and Aaron, all as further proof of God's favour towards the Christians over any other religious group, which he defines in terms of an inheritance given from fathers to sons forever. Now, Peter firmly rooted these claims to custodianship in reference to the pre-Islamic past. The Kitab's description of previous Christian kings and governors who sought out and honoured those holy places by building churches over them worked to establish an inseparable connection between the sites sanctified by their association with Christ and the prophets, of course, with the churches which still remained active during Peter's lifetime. Now, the development of this line of argumentation around about 825 to 850 is unlikely to be coincidental. Indeed, it reflects an emergent concern amongst Christian communities in the Caliphate to the more restrictive attitudes towards churches which appear to have emerged during the later reign of Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809. And these sort of ideas and more restrictive attitudes to churches gained even greater coherence over the course of the 9th century during the reigns of his successors. According to the history of the patriarchs, following a dispute between the Coptic and Melkite patriarchs of Alexandria, Harun al-Rashid issued an edict calling for a destruction of churches which had been constructed after the Arab conquest of the 630s, an order which was enthusiastically followed by the demolition of several churches in Fustat, we are told. Peter Abeitra's emphasis on the pre-Islamic origins of the network of Melkite churches in Palestine and the Transjordan represents his own intellectual efforts to legitimate these churches And this is especially in an environment where claims to custodianship and the right for a church to exist was questioned on the basis of its antiquity. But Peter's emphasis on the network of biblical churches under Melkite control was also no less a reflection of the changing physical landscape of churches and monasteries which had occurred during the course of his lifetime. Now, whilst we can't always chart that change in very detailed chronological terms, it is quite clear that the century and a half spanning about 750 to 900 of the Common Era saw radical change to the Christian world in which Peter lived, as the dense network of rural churches, urban basilicas and monasteries, which had been so characteristic of this region in the late Roman period, steadily contracted and the churches quietly abandoned. Now, exact estimations of the scale of that contraction and its rate remain elusive, but from around 450 separate published churches and monasteries that we are able to identify between the years 450 and 650, we can confirm the survival of only around about 40 by the year 950, and most of them associated either with a city or with a biblical cult. Peter's writing thus pulsates with the concerns of his own day, as the Melkites of Palestine reorientated their world to the churches and cult sites which were fundamental to their identity and who they were as a church, mostly in Jerusalem, and the network of churches and holy sites in the surrounding regions which commemorated the life and miracles of Christ. Now, the explanations for why and how that change are quite complex, and they're not really of direct concern today, but I'm more than happy to discuss that over questions. And indeed, you might all be wondering why a paper on pilgrimage has started with a discussion about Peter. Well, there are two reasons. The first reason is that Peter offers us a perception of this landscape as it was conceptualized and understood by the Christian communities who actually lived there, rather than how it was imagined by Christians who resided beyond the Islamic world, whether that's in the Byzantine Empire or the patchwork of kingdoms of the early medieval West. This latter group of Western medieval Christians, I think, has received by far the most attention in our discussion of pilgrimage to the region after the 9th century. We tend to think about it as a Western phenomenon. Now, indeed, discussions of Holy Land pilgrimage in the early Islamic period are usually indeed synonymous with ideas of pilgrimage from a West, and often framed in terms of dislocation or decline following the breakdown of the Roman imperial control in the region after 632. Now, partly, this emphasis owes much to the sheer availability of Western Latin sources. First, thanks to the editions produced by Titus Tobler and Auguste Moulinier in the 1870s, and also for English-speaking audiences to the accessible translations produced by the Palestine Pilgrims Text Society, which was an associate society of the PEF. And of course, many of us know them through the later translations by John Wilkinson's landmark volume, Jerusalem Pilgrims Before the Crusades. Through them, figures like Arculf of Adamnan's De Locus Sanctis or Willibald of Eichstätt have become widely known, probably more than they were ever known actually during the Middle Ages. Now, these all remain invaluable contributions to this study and the debate, and it's not really my intent to criticise them. But they also aren't without their issues. One is that the compilation of all of these texts into a single bound volume has really encouraged us to view them as part of a coherent ancient genre of pilgrimage texts, which they are not. Inconsistencies in the descriptions of individual churches or of landscapes in Palestine are often routinely compared and charted, often echoing the methodologies of 19th century biblical concordance, but often without really viewing each of these texts as products of individual writers working at specific times in specific places and all motivated by different concerns. Such a focus situates our understanding of pilgrimage to the region almost exclusively in the context of a particular tradition of Latin writings about the Holy Land, which have no parallels in Greek or in Arabic. And of course, it also situates them within a teleological framework which explicitly anticipates the arrival of the Crusades, an alien concept to people in the 9th and 10th centuries. One of the challenges of this theme in this paper is how we essentially break through that Latin looking glass and resituate our knowledge of Western pilgrimage in the early Islamic period as simply one component of a more complex culture of pilgrimage and devotion in which Christians living within the Muslim world predominated. Now, the second reason I began with Peter is because of his focus on churches which commemorated biblical revelations and stories, from Nazareth to Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, all of which reflects another paradigm which is very hard to break free of, the relationship between pilgrimage to this region and the Bible. And there were quite good reasons in Peter's case. The Melkites' ability to retain control of the Church of the Anastasis, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and other sites linked to Christ and the biblical prophets really remained a defining feature of who they were as a community. But as Peter wrote his Kitab al-Burhan, he did so in a wider regional context where churches like this also still formed part of the urban and rural landscapes of the region. Now, this is the mausoleum church of Qais in Jordan, in the former Roman city of Gadara, and it was built in the late 4th century, but still partly in use by the 11th. And it's distinguished as the only church in the city with a crypt beneath the main altar, which was accessed via a stairway, there we are, which permitted access to the burials below, which are there. This echoes similar architectural layouts in Rehovot in the Negev and indeed in other sites like Chovat Berashot, where monumentalized crypts associated with spaces of intercession and prayer were constructed to facilitate the easy movement of devotees. I think it's important to reflect, however, that we know nothing about the identities of the cults associated with Qais. We don't know who was being venerated there, or indeed any of those other churches I've just mentioned. But there is absolutely no reason to suppose that they were in any way linked to the Bible. Evidence from other contexts proposes that Palestine and Arabia, much like other regions of the Mediterranean, were characterized by a more complex relationship between sites of more local devotional significance and major saints and biblical cults. The village of Nasana in the Negev, Auja el-Khafir in Arabic, provides a nice example. Among the papyri corpus recovered during the cult excavations of the 1930s survives a small letter sent by a bishop named George to his associate Father Zunain, and dated to the early 7th century. In the letter, George sends his apologies for not being able to attend the festival, the Eorti, dedicated to St. Sergius, and asks that his donation is passed along to the priest of the church Procopius in his absence. It isn't actually entirely clear which festival he's referring to. Some people prefer to see it as a reference to the festival of Sergius held in Gaza, about 80 kilometres west of Nasana, but others as a reference to a local festival held in Nasana's own church of Sergius, where the document was found. I veer towards the latter. I think it is a local letter for a local cult, but on one level it doesn't actually really matter. Whether located in Gaza or Nasana, the Eorti provides an important witness to the importance such local festivals had as structuring points within local Christian devotion in Palestine at the village level. Other documents in the Nasana corpus also yield examples of donation registers, which list small monetary offerings and goods in kind, like ladles of wine, which were given to the church by devotees from the nearby settlements of Sabata, Elusa, and Betomolacha, a local network in action. The recovery of reliquary boxes at church sites during excavation, 72 at my last count, offer other examples of these local networks and now unknown centres of devotion. So this offers a vision of Palestine and Arabia which is less exclusively biblical and much more late Roman, characterised by an interplay between biblical and major saints cults, often supported by members of the Roman imperial family and its major senatorial families, but alongside that other cults whose significance and importance probably barely stretched beyond the confines of the local village. This might not always have been a harmonious relationship. but neither do I really want to frame this in a kind of anachronistic notion of a high or low church or an elite and poor person's practice. These are all 14th and 15th century concepts which have no place really in the Roman period. So how we integrate these two views then into a cohesive understanding of Christian pilgrimage in the early Islamic period is not an easy task. But I think there is something to be achieved by taking a few steps back and briefly pausing on the question of terminology. What do we mean by a pilgrimage? Now, this is a pretty complex question, which I'm not going to bore everyone with, and it's pretty much been dismantled by generations of anthropologists, historians, theologians, all of whom have stressed how that meaning could change according to region, cultural context, period, and even in terms of an individual's life course. Whether or not somebody is an adult, an older person, or a child can also change that meaning. Absolutely no argument from me, but I want to pick a single strand of this debate, language, to make a few points. Now, for English speakers, the concept of pilgrimage is often quite straightforward and neatly bounded. The Oxford Dictionary describes it as a journey to a holy place for religious reasons, but that's a meaning it didn't acquire until after 1200. Now, implicit within our understanding as English speakers is the idea of a travel or some travel. But it's been well noted in many other studies that Greek speakers active between 600 and 1000 lacked a similar term to describe their own practices. Proskinesis, adoration, reverence, is the most commonly used term in our texts. Nicholas of Sion in the 6th century describes his journey to Jerusalem in the context or using the word proskinesis. One could therefore travel to perform proskinesis, but they didn't have to. One could also perform proskinesis in Jerusalem, but there is no indication in any of our sources that proskinesis performed in Jerusalem was necessarily more special than proskinesis performed anywhere else. The Latin term peregrinatio, travel, wandering, exile, presents similar ambiguities in terms of our understanding of a pilgrimage. Now, by the 11th century, peregrinatio was beginning to acquire a meaning a little bit more akin to our understanding of a pilgrimage and travel, and with a particular emphasis on Jerusalem, but that is an 11th century development. This is also a distinction between Greek and Latin that is worth bearing in mind. It has implications on the way that pilgrimage is described by Latin writers and Greek writers, and we'll come back to it again shortly. Now, finally, descriptions of Christian pilgrimage in Arabic present many of those same ambiguities as in Greek. And this is clearest in the few surviving descriptions that we have of Melkite pilgrimage. One is the Arabic translation of the life of the monk Stephen from the monastery of Marsabas in Jerusalem, which was originally written in Greek in the early 9th century by Leontius of Damascus. Now, towards the end of that text, Leontius describes the journey of his aunt and her former slave from Damascus to Jerusalem during Easter time for the purposes of prayer. But the Arabic translation of the Greek and of that journey simply uses the term salah, to pray. A similar story in the life of the Melkite Timothy of Kakushta, which is dated to the 870s, again attributes Timothy's desire to go to Jerusalem as one of salah. There are no indications that contemporary Islamic notions of pilgrimage or the Hajj influenced the ways that Melkites described their own practices. And this is actually in really marked contrast to other occasions when the adoption of Islamic terms and vocabulary was quite commonplace among Christians in the Caliphate as a means of sort of legitimizing their own belief. Peter of Beit Raz' Kitab al-Burhan, with which I began this paper, is a really nice example. Because the title of the book itself, Kitab al-Burhan, explicitly invokes a passage in the Quran which appeals to Christians and Jews to produce their proof, which Peter then, of course, proceeds to offer throughout the rest of the work, that Christianity was indeed the true revelation. So prayer in Jerusalem evidently mattered for Melkites, but it was not always distinguished, and rather it offered simply a single star within a broader sacred constellation for Melkite Christians. Here's a nice example. Now, this is Selit ibn Said al-Masihi, or Christodoulos, which is the name he took when he became a monk. What we know about him derives from a series of manuscripts which now survive in St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, where he probably served as the librarian towards the end of his life. Now, in the margins of many of the codices contained in the library, which have been identified by Alexander Traeger, he rather naughtily penned his autobiography. Born to a Christian family in Jerusalem around about 980, he moved to Cairo at the age of 5 when his father gained a position as a mutasarrif, a kind of administrator, in the service of the Fatimid Caliph. Saleh appears to him taking up a similar post when he became an adult within the ranks of the Kutab, the Islamic bureaucracy, when he also attained adulthood. However, around about the year 1009, probably as a result of the anti-Christian persecutions of the Caliph al-Hakim, Saleh fled Egypt altogether and spent the next decade moving between the cities and holy sites which lay outside of the control of al-Hakim. During that time, he visited and prayed at the tombs of Thaddeus in Edessa, Kiros at Dair Kuni, around 100 kilometers south of Baghdad, and also at the tomb of St. Mark in Alexandria. And these are also all briefly described in a small note added to Sinai Arabic 309. By 1023, 1024, after al-Hakim had died, Saleh was back in Damascus and then back in Jerusalem, where he describes the liturgy he performed in the Church of the Resurrection, or the Church of the Anastasis, at Easter time. Now, this relationship between prayer and liturgy described by Saleh or Christodoulos actually brings us much, much closer to an understanding of how Melkites themselves understood pilgrimage by the 9th century. For Jerusalem, Easter and the miracle of the Holy Fire performed on Great Saturday loomed large in their imaginations about the city and their desire to go to the city for prayer. Leontius of Damascus, Timothy of Carcushta, and Christodoulos, who we've just spoken about, all journeyed to the city at Easter. The celebrations of Easter spanned several weeks, often involving public processions, stational liturgies held in the city's major churches and moving between them, and also synaxes, gatherings of the region's Melkite clergy. These events attracted large crowds and often the attention of Muslim governors, a reflection of the role that such festivals often performed in the public life of Jerusalem as a city, as well as the importance it had to Christians within their liturgical calendars. The rituals of liturgy, notably the miracle of the Holy Fire, also captured the imaginations of many Muslim writers too, a fascination which has been explored in detail by Anachristos Demides. The 10th century jurist Ibn al-Khas went as far as describing the involvement of the emir and the imam in the rituals itself, often within a broader context where the ritual was often suspected of being a fraudulent ruse cooked up by Melkite clergy using petroleum. But nonetheless one, however fake possibly, was recognised as part of the civic life of the city and bound up in an exercising of popular power and local authority. Now, these interactions were not always harmonious, and indeed attacks against Melkite churches often intensified in periods of heightened liturgical activity, and particularly when those periods of liturgical activity coincided with military confrontations between Byzantium and the Caliphate. Perhaps the best known is the attack against the Church of the Anastasis at Pentecost in 966, which resulted in the church being burnt to the ground and the murder of its patriarch, Yohanna, John VII of Jerusalem, whose body was then subsequently tied to the column of the atrium and burned before the assembled crowd of the city. While Christian festivals often did serve as structuring points for the expression of civic and communal identities, they therefore often could also draw intercommunal tensions into sharper relief, sometimes violently and sometimes fatally. Now, the picture we get moving beyond Jerusalem between the 9th and 10th centuries is less clear, and it relies a great deal on the few scant references that we have from contemporary writers. Regrettably, the longevity of occupation and rebuilding at many Christian church sites in Jerusalem, Nazareth, Bethlehem, first during the period of the Crusader Latin kingdoms and then during the huge waves of rebuilding in the 19th century, has effectively resulted in an almost complete eradication of Melkite material culture, epigraphy and graffiti at all of their most important political and communal centres. Now, the few scant references that we have, like that of al-Masudi from Nazareth, nonetheless alludes to a continuation of practices that we would find broadly familiar from the late Roman period, and these are continuing well into the mid-10th century. Now, Mount Sinai also retained its status as a destination for Melkite Christians drawn from across the Caliphate. Christodoulos, the native of Cairo who we met earlier, was evidently one of them. But his example is replicated in the colophons and marginal notes of many manuscripts at Sinai, which again identify other monks drawn from across all of the territories of the Caliphate, Fustat, Baghdad, Damascus, and more locally at Ramla. More low-level connections are also charted through graffiti, notably that lining the snaking trails of the wadis of the Sinai Peninsula as they move through the Negev, or as people move through the Negev and into the Sinai. Arabic graffiti dating between the 9th to 11th centuries is certainly among them, and some of them are identifiably Christian, a lot of them are ambiguous. Indeed, we know of about 966 examples in Arabic recorded in the last surveys, but not all of them are very easy to pin down to certain groups. But dated inscriptions produced by Christians in Arabic are nevertheless among those cases recorded in our most recent surveys. The earliest that we can date from Sinai is probably to be dated to about 946, 947, and preserves the memory of two pilgrims, Abu Mir and Bastas al-something, we don't know, and a similar votive recorded in the Wadi Mukatab to the 950s was inscribed by Al-Hassan from Al-Maristan. Now, the continuation of these conventions into the 11th century is also attested by other inscriptions too. One commemorating the journey of Asamnur in 1026 in the Wadi Hajjaj, and a now anonymous pilgrim in the Ridan Shukiya. We also have examples of contemporary graffiti in Georgian and Armenian, which has also been noted in recent surveys. Now, the scale of pilgrimage by the 10th century was evidently considerable enough that facilities had to be built to accommodate them. A colophon adorning MS Sinai New Finds 2, sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, dated to 987 and penned by one Kirike Minanzoreli, sorry for any Georgian speakers, notes his own involvement in the construction of a hospice for Arab pilgrims, which appears to have been located close to the main basilica of the monastery, which was dedicated to the Mother of God. Muslims and Muali were also among these visitors, again reflecting a longer and often more complex negotiation of churches and Christian space by Muslims, which first becomes visible in the 7th century. This graffito from the crypt of Hovat Bereshot is one example, left by one Yusuf, son of Yassin, but originally dismissed as evidence for kind of Bedouin squatters, or believed to have been left behind by Bedouin squatters by its original excavators. And I actually see no particular reason for that interpretation or why it should be attributed to post-Christian Bedouin activity. The votive is very well carved, it petitions for intercession, and also respects the spatial arrangements for the relic and the crypt. So whoever carved that inscription was well aware of the use of that building as a Christian space. Now, save for it having been written in Arabic in this period, there's actually very little to distinguish it from other examples of Greek in the same period across the broader regions of Palestine and the Transjordan. And this again points to the importance of churches as syncretic spaces where Christian and Muslim intercommunal tensions, rivalries, but also interactions often played out. But this is also a syncretism that also included pilgrims and travellers from the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe throughout the period too. And I'll dedicate the remainder of this paper to outline some of the features of those experiences as well. Now, the continuation of pilgrimage to Palestine from the Byzantine Empire throughout the early Islamic period is now widely accepted, and particularly since the landmark study of Alice Mary Talbot in 2001. Nevertheless, a kind of quantifiable estimation of the level of pilgrimage after the year 700, let alone 800, remains an impossible ambition. And while it's clear that the annexation of Syria-Palestine from Byzantine control after 632 restricted movement between Palestine and Byzantium, we don't really have any way of measuring that contraction or that loss in any meaningful sense. Now, as with the study, sadly, of contemporary Christian pilgrimage within the Caliphate, surveys of Byzantine pilgrimage to the Holy Land really require us to do a systematic trawl through a range of sources for brief, often quite oblique references to journeys of Palestine, many of which are sometimes difficult to distinguish from more mundane instances of travel. And these difficulties all mirror the ambiguous status that pilgrimage to Jerusalem held in Byzantine belief, and as we saw, the ambiguity of the language used to describe it. The life of Elias the Younger, who died in 903, for example, attributes Elias's journey to Jerusalem to his desire, his pothos, to perform proskinesis before the life-giving cross, echoing an earlier tradition which we saw in the life of Nicholas of Sion and also Theodore of Sicyon, and in the later life of Lazarus of Mount Galatian. As a geographical space, the terms holy city, Aiospolis, or holy places, Aiotopi, similarly lacked the kinds of physical demarcation of a terra sancta, a holy land, which was increasingly associated with the region of Palestine in Latin by the 11th century. In Byzantine texts, the term Palestine, a provincial name, not necessarily signifying a Christian or sacred connotation, was often used by Byzantine writers to describe that space. So, one of the general effects of this ambiguity of what an Aitopi, holy places, really are, is that Byzantine accounts of pilgrimage rarely exhibit the kind of forensic interests in this space about how the landscape looked, how big it was, which is all very characteristic of medieval Latin writings of the same period. Byzantine sources overall, when they mention Jerusalem, which is very rare, are characterised pretty much by their brevity and almost disinterest really in Palestine as a physical living space. Stephen of Chenolacus' journey in the 8th century, for example, is just simply presented as a litany or a list of places and holy sites that he visited. Marsavas, the monastery of Mar Euphemios, the monastery of Mar Theodosius, and the River Jordan. In a similar fashion, Elias the Younger's journey to the region around 900 simply notes his visits to Jerusalem, Sinai, the River Jordan, and Gennesaret. And these are really listed consecutively in the life, but without really any tangible geographical detail. But monastic foundations of the Jerusalem desert, we sometimes know it as the Judean desert as well, notably Marsavas, was also unusually part of the regular itinerary of Byzantine pilgrims, and that sets them apart from Latin travellers. Now, for the purposes of the present discussion, therefore, this throws the distinctions between Byzantine practice and Western practice into sharp relief. For Latin writers of the 9th to 11th centuries, connection and contact with Jerusalem mattered. And certainly to the extent that exchanges between things like Charlemagne's court in Aachen and the Patriarch of Jerusalem were enshrined as part of a historical memory of the Western imperial court. Court writers mention it and they talk about it. By the 10th century, stories narrating Charlemagne's supposed pilgrimage to Jerusalem and his endowment of the city, although really legendary in nature, nonetheless reinforced that symbolic alignment between Western elite identity and Jerusalem pilgrimage into the 10th and 11th century. Byzantine writers rarely mention such activities, and particularly when they're talking about the imperial family. Now, I'm going to hesitate there and to say that this distinction between Byzantium and Western descriptions does not amount to an unqualified Byzantine disinterest in Jerusalem and the Holy Land after the 7th century. The steady, somewhat small flow of monastic pilgrims shows that it did evidently matter. But it really mattered in ways different to the West, and it mattered for entirely different reasons. Rather than as a physical space, it was Jerusalem's role as a kind of symbol of orthodox belief and practice, which it was most readily associated with by Byzantine writers beyond the 7th century. This is clear, for example, where any church councils took place and efforts were made to include representatives from the Church of Jerusalem among them, even if some of them, again, were a bit spurious. But the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 and the Photian Synods of the 860s and 870s all tried to include them. And they are indicative, therefore, of the ideological value that was placed upon Jerusalem as a motif of legitimacy and orthodox practice to uphold a certain set of beliefs. Subsequent descriptions of Byzantine pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the later 9th and 10th centuries are similarly framed in the context of a kind of rigorous ascetic training that individuals desired to receive there. It's basically like a boot camp for the best monks that the empire can produce. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem were often the precursor to extended stays within one of these prominent monastic foundations in the Jerusalem desert, Mar Savas, Mar Euthimios, or Mar Chariton. And this is the place where monks would spend several years honing their training as monks. Germanos of Constanissa, for example, describes himself how uncontrollable desire suddenly struck my heart to hasten first to these holy places and to enjoy the benefit therefrom, and then to entrust myself to one of the monasteries there. Elias the Younger received his initial tonsure from the Patriarch of Jerusalem before spending 3 years in the region among its various monasteries. Lazarus of Mount Galatian's journey to Jerusalem was similarly followed by several years of training at Mar Euthimios, Mar Savas, where again he further honed his skills. In both lives, however, and in both of these texts, the meticulousness and rigour of the Jerusalem desert tradition is always juxtaposed against the laxness of monastic practices that both men had encountered when they were monks in Byzantium. And it's really important to see the sort of the political element of that, about what happens when they go back, because they go back to Byzantium and found their own monasteries in this Jerusalem or Sabitic style. So it has a very political element in terms of how these figures and these cults try to situate themselves and promote their own credentials. These were all, however, connections that were bound to monastic experience, always male, mostly monastic, and therefore very different from those of the contemporary Latin West, to which we will now turn. Now, there are actually no indications that a kind of yearning to visit the Palestinian Holy Land was a uniformly held ideal for Western Christians prior to the Crusades. A lot of that yearning, I think, comes about by the way that we tend to compile texts together. However, the desire to visit the physical spaces associated with the life of Christ could be very intense in individual periods and individual geographical areas. We can't really talk about Western Europe as a homogeneous Christian space. And that therefore did result in periodic sort of bursts of pilgrim traffic from areas of Western and Southern Europe. Now, while based on an erroneous understanding of Scripture, Bernard the monk's emphasis on bearing witness to the place in which Christ had physically drawn his finger into the earth on the Mount of Olives sat within a broader tradition of Latin exegesis and interest in the Holy Land, which could trace its origins to the ideas of Augustine, Jerome, and Paulinus of Nola, that emphasis in the physicality of that landscape. Just over a century and a half later, the priest Jacinthus recalled of his own journey to Jerusalem and Bethlehem in the 1020s, that he had longed to see the most holy places where our Lord Jesus Christ was born and where he bore his sufferings for the whole world. Another Western trope with its emphasis on the corporeality of Christ. Again, a very different concept to the Greek-speaking East. Now, documented cases of pilgrims journeying from Jerusalem from Western Europe are attested in almost every century across the early Islamic period. But they become particularly visible in our sources by 950, and they peak around a century later. Now, how we interpret this, either as a genuine rise in the number of pilgrims responding to better travel conditions and shifts in terms of Latin popular piety, or perhaps simply just the fact that our source material is better after 900, is slightly less clear. I think a combination of the two appears likely. That's a bit of a cowardly way out, isn't it? In any case, I think both observations must be prefaced by a caveat. Although records of these journeys were evidently important to the individuals and writers from the West who undertook them, the Melkites, the indigenous Christians of Palestine, are universally silent on their presence within the region, and they accorded them no status within their collective historical memory. They were peripheral to the Melkite worldview. Now, the itineraries followed by pilgrims from the West are very difficult to reconstruct, often in view of the brevity with which they're described, although by the 10th century, travel to this region appears to have been undertaken in a number of stages, involving a bit of sea travel and a bit of overland travel. Access to Palestine was usually facilitated by what were then the region's major coastal ports, usually at Tripoli, Tyre, Akka, after which pilgrimage then proceeded southwards on foot. The Great Pilgrimage of 1065-66 crossed from Anatolia to Tripoli before proceeding to Jerusalem via Caesarea and Ramla, and that echoes an earlier journey followed by Willibald of Eichstätt in the 720s. Now, the primary destination for the Western pilgrims was Jerusalem, and within the city itself, the sepulchre or the tomb of Christ, described as a sepulchrum, which was housed within the Church of the Resurrection. Descriptions of the individual experiences of pilgrimage at the tomb dominate most of those recorded accounts, often to the extent actually we don't really know what they made of any other church in the region. Churches linked to the Bible also predominate within those accounts, actually leaving us with very little sense about how Western pilgrims interacted with the city-based churches and monasteries that we know existed from other sources, particularly Melkite foundations in Gaza, in Ascalon, in Ramla. We have absolutely no idea what Western Christians made of them. Now, the Church of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives held particular importance for visitors, particularly because of its connection with the end of days. But the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, the Baptism Monastery of the Jordan and Mount Sinai also occasionally form part of the itineraries of travellers from the West. Now, the earliest account of pilgrimage to Jerusalem from the 10th century that we can securely date relates to the journey of Adelinda, the Countess of Swabia, around the year 900, which occurred following the death of her 3 sons. Now, it's not exactly entirely clear how widely those actions were part of a broader social movement around 900, but it was certainly widely replicated in later decades. And Adelinda's journey really signals the beginning of a wider interest in Jerusalem, which was closely tied to Ottonian aristocratic devotion. The pilgrimage of Hida in 960. Hida was the daughter of Theitmar of the First and the mother of Gero, Archbishop of Cologne, and this really exemplifies the close interconnection between Jerusalem pilgrimage and aristocratic identity. Hida's journey was succeeded a decade later by the pilgrimage of Judith, the mother of Henry II, Duke of Bavaria, and that of Conrad, Bishop of Constance, whose final journey to Jerusalem occurred shortly before his death in 975. Subsequent journeys to Jerusalem were also actively pursued by clergy from regions closely associated with the Ottonian elite, including Adso of the Abbey of Montier-en-Der, Adalbert, Bishop of Prague, who are reported to have gone on to Jerusalem in 922 and 997. Now, excluding the supposed mass pilgrimage of 1065, which we don't actually know how many people went, between Hida's pilgrimage and the surrender of Jerusalem to the crusading armies in 1099, around 40 documented cases of Western pilgrimage to the Levant are known, with notable peaks in activity around about the year 1000 and the year 1033, which may have coincided with the millennial anniversaries associated with Christ. But beyond its penitential significance, an important feature of Western pilgrimage to Jerusalem was its strong connection to Benedictine devotional practice. This association intensified in the 11th century, and nowhere more so than in Normandy, where pilgrimages to Jerusalem were frequently linked to prominent monastic clergy from Benedictine foundations. But the connection was already an established one even before 1050. Prior to the year 1000, at least 4 monks of Monte Cassino, the Benedictine community of Italy, went to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, as did Adso, abbot of Montier-en-Der, and Poppo of Stavelot. Hida, when she returned in 960, and her wider family also established several monastic foundations. So the overall significance of these Western journeys as part of a broader culture of pilgrimage in this region during the early Islamic period is unclear. But the intermittent nature of these exchanges meant that they probably never really formed a major component of those connections, particularly those maintained by the Palestinian Melkites. Now, this is not to imply that they were entirely insignificant. While traditions of Melkite writing and history writing didn't really afford any status to these Western connections, attempts by the Patriarch of Jerusalem to cultivate relationships with pilgrims and with Western rulers shows that such networks and connections did matter when they were possible. But they were often hyper-centralised and hyper-focused, limited to the Church of the Anastasis, particularly Christ's tomb, and its attendant clergy, with the exception of a few other places where foundations like Mar Savas and Mount Sinai utilised their own prestige to foster similar connections beyond the borders of the Muslim world. But they were also very exceptional, even within Palestine itself. There are very few indications that Melkite churches outside of that sort of core network enjoyed such far-reaching or intense relationships of connection, devotion, or reciprocity. Melkite connections with urban centres and with the other churches of the Islamic world, as we've seen, were much, much more complex, and they stretched much, much wider. But they also sort of display an increasingly centripetal tendency after the 9th century to Jerusalem, Sinai, and the monastic network of the Jerusalem desert. And they were all these foundations increasingly dominated the horizons of the Melkite elite as focal points for their expression and their piety. With the evaporation or the kind of contraction of the diverse rural landscape of small family-sponsored basilicas and now anonymous pilgrimage churches, which have been so characteristic of Palestine's landscape between the 5th and the 8th centuries, regrettably, with all of that loss, also ends our ability really to observe the complexity of this more localised culture of devotion in any real detail. The picture of pilgrimage which emerges between 800 and 1099 is more simplistic and less centralised than it had been 2 centuries earlier, increasingly biblical, more clerical, almost exclusively male. What we might say, for instance, of the actions of villagers or village communities, or that of Christian women in the Muslim world as components of that broader system, amounts to almost nothing. That this collective activity was sufficient to sustain a network of monasteries and churches is clear, both from manuscript colophons and the few references that we have from contemporary writers. The ability for Christians to facilitate at least 4 major episodes of rebuilding and repair at the Church of the Anastasis is also one very clear indication that Christians within the Muslim world remain capable of amassing and mobilising resources when they were necessary to underpin the survival of their most important churches. But it is sadly a culture which, beyond a handful of manuscripts, is very difficult to visualise and appreciate in a material or spatial sense, in terms of what those churches looked like, how they were physically constructed, and the attendant paraphernalia of objects and furnishings and movements which transformed these churches into functional spaces imbued with meaning and with memory. While the formation of the Latin Crusader kingdoms certainly sparked the emergence of a more energetic and visible culture of pilgrimage after 1100, it also simultaneously inaugurated an almost systematic destruction of the local Melkite culture of devotion and belief which had preceded it. The future challenge for historians of this region is how we might throw better light on its remaining shadows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Catch your breath. Do you need some water or anything? You're all good?
I have a glass of water.
Have a glass of water. If you've got some more, we'll find some water. So, Dan, are you okay to answer some questions?
Of course.
While we hydrate?
I will have a glass.
Yeah, great. Do you mind if I use my chair's privilege first? Is that okay with you? So, assuming that the Reynolds credited in some of these photographs was indeed your good self, you've spent some time in these holy landscapes. How important was that for you to be there? Did experiencing the landscape as it is today impact your approach to this at all, change your views on some of these aspects that are missing in the written record?
Yes and no, coward's answer.
Yeah.
I think actually being in that region, it does things like the features like the Dead Sea Rift really give you a better understanding about how and why people move through that landscape in the ways that they do. So you can actually see why. Oh, thanks, Felicity. And therefore you can see why certain routes emerge because they are simply easiest. But also actually observing, one of the nicest things you see with the graffiti often is, it has been observed by surveyors, is that quite often they're located in places where you've got shade in the afternoon. So you get a sense of basically people stopping and carving while they're resting. So it gives you a very subtle insight into how people react to the natural world around them. In terms of the building themselves, it's actually very difficult because unfortunately ground plans are not very exciting. When you go into them, you are looking at maybe 1.5 foot, of course you're missing everything about the paraphernalia that gave those spaces meaning. Things like curtains, which we know existed in Byzantine, in churches rather, no longer survive, but they have a huge influence in terms of the way that space and movement happens. But there has, I've been looking at this, and people have been doing work on this about the role of inscriptions on floors, particularly in terms of understanding how space worked, about how it's targeting specific groups, particularly with very more public inscriptions in the main nave, or private family ones in the aisles. That's not uncommon now in contemporary churches either. So yes and no, if that makes sense, but I'm very cautious about imposing too much of a reading on that space, because I'm coming into it as also an atheist who is also raised in the Protestant tradition. And it is very difficult, I think, to sometimes appreciate, as someone who was raised in the Protestant tradition, that locality of cult, the idea that Evlohia, blessing, can be acquired locally, is something that's quite alien to a mindset which sees pilgrimage as an external phenomenon. So, does that answer the question?
It does. If I might just follow up with the human landscape.
Yeah.
When you were meeting people in Egypt or Palestine or Israel or Jordan, Christians potentially, and you explained what you were doing, did it generate any interesting responses, or did you sort of just wander around without attracting too much interest?
Actually, I was on my own. not sole insight. Umkais is not among the more. It's not among the more popular destinations in Jordan. Jerash tends to dominate, so it was quite quiet. People are interested. What's very interesting, actually, you see there are small elements of continuity of things going on. So Mar Elias in Jordan, which is near Al Jun, you have trees that still have ribbons tied to them in the church site. So there is still some recognition. And this is actually noted anthropologically in the 19th and early 20th centuries about when people spoke to the Bedouin and things, there are still names and associations of these places with Christian cult. But sadly, no, unfortunately, in Jerash it was full of Europeans who just thought I was odd. Jerusalem was a very difficult experience as well, because going as a Byzantinist to Jerusalem is a very disappointing experience, because there's almost nothing left. I had to find the near church of the Theotokos, which is in the Jewish quarter of the city. It is basically abandoned, and it's just full of Coke cans. And this is one of the major foundations of the 6th century. So it's a deeply unspiritual experience when you go there, and it's full of teenagers on skateboards. It's because it stopped being a major church in the 10th century. So people are very bemused, I found, actually, that what are you looking for? I'm looking for the near church built by Justinian. But yeah, it was, yeah.
You had fun.
I had fun.
Excellent. Right, let's stop hogging you now. So you had a question.
I did. Thinking of the Western pilgrims here and possibly Greek pilgrims, did any of them talk about bringing back relics? Because, going back 600 years to Helena, who went and brought back all these relics. And the Western churches are full of relics.
Yeah. Western ones, yes, a lot. They mention them a great deal. So Ulrich, Bishop of Orleans, brings back oil from the Festival of the Holy Fire. Relics of the cross are brought back, and quite often as well it's followed up by a foundation of a new church in Central Europe or in England dedicated to the Holy Cross. And at the same time you have the emergence of the simulacra, so replicas of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Britain or in continental Europe. Byzantine pilgrims less so. The relics, that is partly because Constantinople already considered itself to have those relics. The true cross was taken back in Byzantine tradition to Constantinople after the Persian War in 628. The Mandilion of Edessa, so the cloth on which Christ pressed his face, was taken in the 10th century after the Byzantine retaking of that region, and it was taken out of Edessa. So we know why. That's why when texts talk about the Mandilion in Edessa, we know it predates that period, but after that it translates. And the Byzantines talk about Constantinople in ways very similar to Jerusalem. They see it as a new Jerusalem because of the presence of these relics. So in a sense there was not much need to acquire them because they perceived to already have
They've got them already.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, please, yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, was there a tradition of pilgrimage within the Judaic religion prior to Christianity? Did they visit holy sites in the similar way, or was it a thing that started with Christians?
No, there is. This is not something I'm qualified to talk a great deal about. There is, but what's very interesting, those two, as far as I can see, those two networks don't appear to intersect, at least by my period. They're very distinct. Islamic Christian networks frequently overlap, but I've seen very, very little evidence to suggest that Jewish ones did. It is quite clear, however, from inscriptions in Nabatean and snaking up to Sinai, that area has had busy traffic for a very long time, and that's true also of the Wadi Rum in southern Jordan as well. So there has been movement along these for a lot longer than Christianity, but they are notoriously difficult to date. And one of the problems we have with Jewish communities in the Byzantine period is they're very difficult to trace outside of the Galilee, and this is partly because of the way we excavate. So in order to prove the existence of a Jewish community, we dig for synagogues, which is not really the right way of going about it. It's almost like trying to find the way that we gender archaeology and the implicitness of men. We have to look for the existence of women, which is a ridiculous concept, because they've always been at least 50% of the global population. And Jewish communities in Byzantine planet are similar as well. We look for tangible evidence to prove rather than implicitly assume they're there. The problem we have, however, is that the Roman Empire is much more restrictive against Jewish communities than the early Islamic Caliphate was. So Jewish communities, as far as we can see, actually grow and expand after Muslim rule than beforehand, that we know of anyway. So yes, points of interconnection definitely for a long time.
Yeah, just to follow up a little bit, going back further, and I'm not an expert, but just from my kind of general knowledge, into the kind of Herodian and early Roman period, and probably further back still, there was a requirement for all Jews to visit the temple on pilgrimage, in a similar way that Muslims are encouraged, let's say, to perform the Hajj. And and this ties in as well. I mean, pilgrimage as a concept is there in many, many religions, I think.
Yeah.
And going back further into Canaanite traditions, you can see similar kind of patterns of activity, congregating in certain places, sometimes very seasonally as well, which indicates some kind of pilgrimage tradition, often around things like healing and water, which of course have real importance to people directly in their daily lives. But the other thing I'm wondering about in this this early Islamic period in particular is that tying into pilgrimage is that it's an amazingly handy revenue building tool.
Yeah.
And this is very true. Think about, you know, the moneylenders in the temple. It's a whole engine of activities that can make money for someone at the top. And I just wondered, though, in this rather more diffuse landscape, after the huge investments of the Byzantine period and these huge churches in the Negev and elsewhere, and does the caliphate take a specific interest in the pilgrimages from the point of view of revenue?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Yes, in parts. So it's quite clear in some of the sources that periodically fines and taxes are levied on on an institutional level, that's right, and then there's the low level stuff. So institutionally, yes, periodically levied taxes. There doesn't ever appear, however, to have been anything directly aimed at pilgrims. It's always aimed at just churches. But this also plays into the fact that what Melkite Christians do after the 9th century is that they completely reorientate their economy away from landholding and villages towards serving as bureaucrats in the Islamic State. And what they then do is use that position to negotiate opt-outs for individual churches. So the Church of the Anastasis basically manages to get itself, by the 11th century, and so does Sinai, classified as a charitable foundation. So therefore it is non-taxable. So what you get emerging between Melkites is huge intercommunal tensions between those who have access to the caliph, either through marriage or by jobs, and Melkite churches that don't. So Church of the Anastasis, Bethlehem, Sinai really aggressively do this, and the others just fall into poverty. Institutionally as well, after Al-Hakim destroys the Church of the Anastasis and the church is rebuilt, it is increasingly under the control of the Byzantine imperial family, and they do levy taxes, but only on Western Christians. So the Pope writes to Anna Dalasini to say, please stop taxing fellow Christians, why are you doing this?
Okay.
So the Byzantines also know that this is a revenue thing. Locally, on low level, what we get is less a kind of tax, but more of a recognition that pilgrims are very vulnerable. They're often very wealthy and they're carrying big bags of cash. So there's a lot of anxiety about moving outside of cities. That's where people get picked on. Yeah, I think that's as much as. But charitable foundations is a big one, and that what they tend to do is have documents saying, well, in the reign of this caliph, he said that we didn't need to pay anything. But this becomes a big problem as well, because what happens is that the caliphate ends up with huge institutions like the Church of the Anastasis, which is nearly 1,000 years old by then, and in a region which is still predominantly Christian in population, having a charitable status is non-taxable. So, I mean, the problem with Al-Hakim, we tend to talk about Al-Hakim as the mad caliph, but actually what he does is actually very astute, because he attacked the Church of the Anastasis and the palace in Fustat, which is the Melkites' main political centre, so he automatically neutralises them in a year. So they stop being a political threat to him. So, yeah, I think that's a very circuitous answer, sorry.
The early pilgrims, did they, in their movement round, they would describe the churches or the sites that they visited, but were they also aware of the Muslim geography or structures? I mean, they seem to have ignored, let's say, the temple area. I mean, in the Madaba map, you can't see.
You can't see it. Yeah.
You can't see it, but in the buildings are right up against the city wall. There's nothing there.
Yeah.
And apparently, the few pilgrims that I've read about referred to it as really the carrying out of Christ's saying of the destruction.
Yeah. That pretty much follows through. They, at least in descriptions of Jerusalem, the presence of Muslims, which is usually referred to as Saracens or Sarakeni in Greek, they do appear, and they occasionally mention mosques, but never in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock is a complete blank space. Arkolf,
Does he exist? Did he exist?
I'm not certain.
Right.
But I follow. I think one of the things. I fall on the same with Tom O'Loughlin has published about this, and I'm not certain. On one level, actually, I think the way that the landscape is presented doesn't really matter because it's actually trying to do other things with that text anyway. And Bernard the monk's description in the 860s is also very informed by an exegetical understanding of what Christians felt they needed to know about the city rather than as it was. So the example I gave you there with Christ drawing the line in the Mount of Olives, that church could never have existed because it's based on a misreading of the gospel. And that's because that passage actually is a later interpolation that was often written in the 9th century when people thought it was genuine. So whoever the scribe was put the full stop in the wrong place, because actually that whole episode takes place in the temple the following day, and all you have to do is move the full stop. He doesn't mention the Dome of the Rock either, because again it's not part of their salvationary idea. The Jerusalem he presents is basically moving through the movements of the Passion. So that story of Christ drawing the line, he thinks is on the Mount of Olives because that story was recited during the Easter liturgy for the Carolingian Church in Rome by the 860s. So what he's presenting is, it's almost like proving what he already knows. And that's common in a lot of medieval travelogues, to be honest. The overarching message of Byzantium is travel's fine, but it's better to stay at home. So yeah, I think that answers your question anyway, roundabout way.
Look at this, we're going to keep going until midnight by this rate, please.
I was reading about Nasana, so obviously it's got the fantastic papyri.
Oh yeah.
But obviously after about the early 7th century, that the whole community seems to sort of disappear or reduce in size quite a lot. I was just wondering if there's any indication of how the later pilgrims would have approached Sinai, because obviously that's a really good route to take.
Yeah.
And I think in the record it says they had a hospital as well.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the hospital for Melkites.
Yeah.
That was founded. So I was just wondering if they approached maybe from Cairo, or if they took a different route through the desert. But
the Negev still gets used well into the 11th century. And it's quite clear that there's not a big community at Nasana after the 8th century, but there's something going on in the 10th. We're not, Shibtaran have been so badly, not well excavated, that we don't know, but there's Arabic graffiti and Georgian graffiti on many of those churches suggesting that people are still following those routes well into the 11th century. We have a very nice one which I couldn't use, but of a guy called Al-Badr, who we pick up in Rehovot. Well, this map is useless. Sorry. Sorry, let me go back for those unfamiliar. No, that's a bit too far forward. That's a bit better. Okay. So we pick him up around here in one inscription, and we also pick him up again in the Wadi Hajjaj in a slightly later inscription. So we can trace, we know he's moving. But what we see, a lot of people are coming from Ayla and then just moving down. This area here appears to be where a lot of Egyptian pilgrimage are coming from, so it's quite a coastal enterprise. In the later period, what appears to have happened is most people followed the coast as far as they could and then went down. So you're right, I think it does, movement certainly continues, but probably not on the same level. Because by this point as well, this whole area here is sedentary occupation is quite sparse compared to what it had been in the 6th and 7th century. So.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if beyond the texts and the inscriptions, the sites, if there's any form of material culture that informs about pilgrims and pilgrimage, or did pilgrims leave any trace in the archaeological record, or were they invisible?
They're, for this period, invisible. And that's partly because all of the churches which will have told us the most, the Crusaders reappropriated and completely rebuilt. So anything, I mean, it is almost a sort of systematic annihilation of a culture. And again, in the 19th century, what didn't get done over in the Crusades got done over in the 19th century. We have things like pilgrims' tokens, which were made of, we call them Evlohia tokens. I don't know if you've heard of them. Okay, so they're made of earth or clay, which is taken from around a saint's tomb, and they're usually stamped and then baked. We don't know why people, but that is they had contained with them in a blessing. We think people ate them, but we're not sure. The problem with those is they are, because of that artificial truncation of the early Islamic period and that view to see it as a break with everything, they have all been dated to the Byzantine period, even though some of those tokens have been found in Umayyad and Abbasid archaeological layers. They've said, oh, it's an anomaly. It must be, it's a 6th century anomaly. And actually, well, if it's something like the tomb of the Virgin Mary, that goes on into the 12th century. There's no reason why it can't. That's about all we have, and lead flasks which had oil or liquid in them. But sadly, no. We don't know where they stayed. And I think, again, this is part of the issue, is because in the littoral, in Palestine particularly, less so in the Transjordan, the most successful cities of the early Islamic period are still the biggest cities now. Ramla, Ashkelon, Jerusalem, so all of these places where we would hope to find this stuff is now buried under layers of modern building. And that's, I mean, this is the problem we have, because we always get a negative image, because the Negev, as beautiful as those cities are failed settlements. But yet we know about things like weaving, we know about it from texts that people did. Fabrics were taken, Evlohia tokens, but nothing else. In the 16th century, people's names change in accordance where the term Haji comes from, you know, yeah. But that's a 15th, 16th century thing. So.
I think we've grilled Dan enough for now, so maybe we should retire to some refreshments, but let's thank Dan again for this absolutely fascinating